24/7 World Radio with our podcast that we have regularly with Brother George Widger, and Brother George is with us now, and it is June 27th, 2004. It is a Thursday. So, Brother George, welcome to the broadcast.
Well, thank you. As always, brother, it's a pleasure to be on with you.
It's always my pleasure to be with you. You always have something new and astounding to teach me, so I do thank you for that, and I know it takes a lot of work to dig these things out, so I'm sure the listeners greatly appreciate you too, as many of them have to say. So what would you like to begin with today, my brother?
Well, my scripture verse is Romans 1, verse 17. Romans 1, verse 17, and I'm sure it's a familiar passage to you and probably to many of your listeners. It says, "Therein is the righteousness of God, revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." Now, I realize this might seem fairly straightforward, and it's a fairly simple phrase. The just shall live by faith. And I remember back in, it was 1996, 1997, when I was living in Sacramento, California, I was reading my local rag, the Sacramento Bee, because on Saturdays it was their religious section. It used to be fairly okay for.
By the way, I used to visit my grandparents when I was growing up, and my mother would take us, myself and my two brothers and sister, to see my grandparents Callahan on 2619 O Street in Sacramento. It was an apartment. And my grandfather always had the Sacramento Bee out there. So when you talk about the Sacramento Bee, that brings back memories. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as I said, the Bee, like most papers on Saturdays, would have their religious section in which they would talk about whatever religious topic was popular at the time. We're talking the 1990s. They would also advertise for local churches, like the name of the church, its locations, its phone number, things like that. And later on, its web address. And they would do a topic, whatever was relevant at the time, and then they'd do a Q&A section for local clergy. When I say clergy, I'm talking about pastors, priests, rabbis. I know this may sound like a setup for a barroom joke, and they would actually occasionally talk to imams, which is like a Muslim clerk. Mm-hmm. And they would ask them, various questions like, "Oh, do you think the Bible supports, or do you think capital punishment is acceptable, or corporal punishment is acceptable, to spanking, or whatever?" Well, anyhow, I remember, getting back to my point, I remember this is, as I said, like around 1996 or thereabouts, and it had just, the previous year was the 30th anniversary of the conclusion of Vatican II, which took place between 1962 and 1995.
So, George, are you all right? It sounds like some boxes are tumbling down on you. Are you okay?
Oh, I'm sorry. My neighbor just got a 155 millimeter howitzer. He was just testing it out.
Okay. I just want to know if you're okay, George. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, just so long as the shells don't land on me, I should be good to go. Well, anyhow, the you're throwing away some tires. But anyhow, so one of the things they mentioned in this article was the decline in the number of Catholics going to the confessional in percentages and in actual raw numbers. I don't remember what they said, but it's like, so per capita, probably less than half the Catholics in 1995 were going to confessional as they were in 1965, at least in the United States. And this was a real head scratcher. And I remember, I guess a few days later, somebody wrote a letter to the editor saying, it was obviously a Catholic, and he said, "Well, I can explain this, because it seems that a lot of Catholics have bought into this whole Protestant canard, this heresy of sola fide, i.e. justification through faith alone." And I, at the time, I really didn't know my Bible. I didn't know theology. So basically, as your typical American churchgoer, and I had no idea what he was talking about. What is sola fide? What is justification through faith alone? So this is like at the dawn of the internet age, but I wasn't online yet. That wouldn't mean until like around 1998 or thereabouts. So I had to go look it up the old-fashioned way in a book. I'm sure you might have heard of those. Actually,
every now and then, George. Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's like these things with bindings and pages, and you turn them over. You might have seen one in a museum, but anyhow. So as I said, I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. What is justification by faith alone? What is therefore, sola fide? And so I had to go track it down, and I got back to the scripture verse, Romans 1:17, and this purportedly precipitated the salvation of Martin Luther about 500 years ago.
That's right.
Yeah. So I really had no idea what justification meant, other than in a secular use. But it had a negative connotation, at least to me. It means to rationalize or to excuse behavior, usually criminal behavior, such as justifiable homicide. And so I began this little quest, if you will, looking up Martin Luther. I knew who he was. He was like this monk who lived hundreds of years ago over in Germany, had some problems with the Catholic Church. But I really didn't know much about the man. And this is embarrassing to admit this. So I had to go look up everything I could on Martin Luther. So I had to look up everything I could on the Protestant Reformation, and Zwingli and Calvin and the Anabaptists and the Council of Trent and the creation of the Jesuits and the various, Reformed theology, Presbyterian theology, the Anglican Church, Henry VIII.
Yep, very critical time, very wonderful, critical time in history. It's the fulcrum of political liberty beginning in 1648. It's a wonderful, wonderful time, epoch of time to be familiar with, because then we understand what's happening now.
Okay, so forgive me for boring you and your audience, but as I said, this took me months, actually years, to try to look all this stuff up. I looked in reference material, like almanacs, or rather encyclopedias. And so, but I had to go start looking up books at my library the best I could. And I became inquisitive. So it took me a while to figure out what justification through faith alone means and why it was a big deal 500 years ago or thereabouts. And so to get back to what this letter writer was saying in our local paper, saying that the Catholics are saying, in the rest of the letter, he said, it seems that a number of Catholics had bought into this error that, hey, I'm justified by putting my faith in Jesus, and therefore they don't need to go to the confessional anymore. And if they have something in their mind, they can go to a therapist or something like that. So anyhow, that was how I began this quest.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, the embarrassing thing is I was never taught this in school when, growing up. I never learned this in college or anything along those lines. And not to sound bitter, but maybe I should have got a refund.
Maybe. I mean, they're not going to teach you about the Protestant Reformation and the great things that came about because of that. And they're definitely not going to teach you about the Jesuits, that their whole purpose is to counter the Reformation and all the grand and glorious discoveries and scientific advancements made during the last 500 years. They don't want you to know that. So they don't teach it in high schools. They don't teach it in college. It is an absolute forbidden topic.
Well, they definitely don't teach it in secular colleges, and they, for the most part, they don't teach it in so-called Christian colleges.
Well, it should be taught as a political movement. It should be taught as when men started to read this book, political things started to happen. And then they should teach it as far as a political movement with these men who believe this book, what they did politically and on the battlefield and in the law. And that's completely secular. I mean, that's a secular topic based upon spiritual activity. but it's never taught. They don't want to teach you that notable history of the modern era that began in 1648 and what brought that about, the breaking of the Pope's temporal power. They do not want you to know how that happened. Because if you do, then you're going to be able to do it again. And that's definitely what they do not want, especially now when they're on the brink of their successfully having subdued all nations to the political power of the Pope.
Well, speaking of temporal power of the Pope, something I probably should bring up is this evening at about 8 o'clock Eastern, there's supposed to be a rematch between Joe Biden, the 45th U.S. president, and the 44th president, Donald Trump. And they're supposed to be having it, I guess, at the CNN studio in Atlanta, Georgia. And I plan on watching it on YouTube for entertainment purposes. And because that's basically all it would be good for. And it's going to be, and rest assured, they're going to have an able, very capable moderator, Jake Tapper.
He's an arrogant individual and anti-Trump and pro-Biden. So that'll be very another agitation. Realizing, of course, that both those men work together. Tapper is CFR, and he is ultimately subordinate to the Archbishop of New York, who is the prince in charge of the Pope's American Empire.
Okay, so I guess the other B'nai B'rith Jew, Chris Wallace, wasn't available, so they had to settle for Jake Tapper.
So Tapper is a B'nai B'rith Jew?
Yes, although his mother is Presbyterian.
Uh-huh. Well, that's typical. Presbyterian's apostate, so there's not going to be any objection to it. I mean, the Presbyterians used to be once a great Reformed Protestant church. You can find these old Presbyterian, beautiful church buildings in Pennsylvania here, in Harrisburg, Lancaster. I mean, all sorts of beautiful, old, big brick church buildings. And they're empty, or they're apostate with just a smitten people there. So there's no political movement as a result of the great Presbyterian church that once existed. It no longer stands against the papacy or the temporal power of the Pope.
Okay, so the days of James Wiley and Robert Dabney, those are long since over.
Yes, sir. 100 years, yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now it's interesting. You're talking about secular universities and about what you'll learn or won't learn. Okay, so if you look at one of the great schools in North Carolina, Duke, the chancellor there is Vincent Price. No, not the actor. This is a different Vince Price. He's I believe he's the chancellor there. And he got his undergrad degree from Santa Clara University, and he got his master's degree from Stanford.
So here we have the vice chancellor of Duke, trained by the Jesuits at University of Santa Clara.
Correct. And then he got his master's.
That just further confirms what my dear friend, Brother Ed, out of Baltimore, out of Maryland, said to me. That the 81-year-old Jesuit that he knows told him that we control all the universities. Brother Ed Canfield, thank you, brother, for all your wonderful work you're doing. And it would be nice to get that Jesuit on this broadcast, but he will not come on it. So, but he's right. They run all the major universities.
Okay, and so we've talked about how they run UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, how they run Calvin College, how they run University of Houston in Texas Law School, because they have a matriculation agreement with Loyola New Orleans.
I'd venture to say they also control Dallas Theological Seminary now. Norman Geisler was a professor there for years, and he was trained by the Jesuits at Loyola in Chicago. Yep. There's no denunciation of the Roman papacy out of Dallas Theological Seminary.
Yes, I mean that's been the case for a long time. One of the theology professors is Tim Yoda, Yoda isn't like the character from Star Wars. But well, I mean, a Yoder, Yoder. He got both his master's and a PhD from Marquette University.
Is that right? And he's a teacher at Dallas?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, they just take over everything with their students that they train and send them out to conquer the Reformation. And that's Dallas is conquered, and I bet you to say most of the others are conquered. Yeah, go ahead, George.
Okay, so I'd just like to mention, so I mentioned the upcoming debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and it should be amusing. And of course, I like watching Donald Trump because, well, he's entertaining.
Sure, he's entertaining. And playing off Joe Biden, it ought to be a real entertaining evening. Whereas they're friends, and they work together. And there isn't much more Joe Biden could do than to further ensconce and enthrone Trump in the coming quote-unquote selection coming up in November.
Okay, well, and so as I said, it might be good for a laugh or two. And I'd just like to mention a couple of recent deaths, a couple of obituaries. And probably the two most prominent were the baseball player Willie Mays, who took the bulk of his career with the San Francisco Giants. Now, he started out, the Giants were originally in New York, in Queens. And he played there in the 50s. And in the late 50s, the Giants and the Dodgers, who were in Brooklyn, moved to California, the Dodgers in LA, and the Giants in San Francisco. And last week, Willie Mays died at the age of 93. And
93. Willie Mays was always a happy guy. Mm-hmm. And all of us young white guys we loved Willie Mays. We thought he was just the greatest center fielder around. He'd catch the ball at his waist with his glove. And he was called the Say Hey Kid. Mm-hmm. So Willie Mays was a favorite of ours. And sorry
for bursting your bubble. I'm sure he was a tremendous athlete, but there's a reason why he was elevated, because he was among other things, he was I'm going to say benign. He was actually Prince Hall Freemason.
So he's Prince Hall and Tapper's B'nai B'rith. That's right. So they exalt him in the public arena because of their Masonic connections. By the way, I was in Staples, and Staples is given over to the blacks. All the advertisement in Staples are primarily black with Shaquille O'Neal. And I was looking at one of the posters that he was posting in, and on his right hand, between his thumb and his forefinger, he has tattooed the compass and the square with the G in the middle of it. That is tattooed on his right hand, and I thought, my, quite interesting. But go ahead, brother.
Oh, yes, of course. Almost all your prominent black figures over the last 100+ years, at least in the United States, 150 years, have been, or generally speaking, Prince Hall. Now, I said that Willie Mays just died, and pretty much all your prominent players or people associated with Major League Baseball, players, announcers, owners, were Catholic, Freemasons, or something along those lines. Henry Aaron, who just died 3 years ago, he was a convert to the Catholic Church. Frank Robinson, who, not to be confused with Jackie Robinson, got his undergrad degree from Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. Bob Gibson, who is arguably the best black pitcher of all time, got his undergrad degree from Creighton. Now, in terms of, say, whites or, Babe Ruth, that's a matter of debate. Babe Ruth was a Roman Catholic, a Freemason, a Knight of Columbus, and he's trained by the Xavier brothers in St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys in Baltimore.
And a serial fornicator, so that clearly qualified him too. Go ahead.
Yes, now, as I said, there's some question about Babe Ruth's lineage, because was he partially black? Perhaps. If he were, he was definitely a passer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who knows? They exalt their mulattoes and quadroons everywhere they can. J. Edgar Hoover was a quadroon. Mm-hmm. He was not entirely white. And I learned that from a black man. So, yep. So the quadroons and the mulattoes are more faithful to the white power structure than the pure blacks are. Go ahead, brother.
Oh, okay. And well, you also had the death of actor the Canadian-born Donald Sutherland. Now, he died in Miami last week at the age of 88.
Having lived a long, sinful, wicked life of propaganda, left-wing communist ideology, and also the actor in JFK, where he played a very good role, but he never went out after that and said, you know what, we need to find these weird guys that shot Kennedy. Because these actors, all they want is their money and to play the part, and then they can go along and just forget it. Like Kevin Costner, another one, but go ahead.
Okay, so are you referring to his role as Mr. X, which is basically
Yes.
which is basically Fletcher Prouty?
Yes, playing the role of Fletcher Prouty.
Okay, so, and he had a number of prominent roles going back, to the 1960s, and I enjoyed a number of his films. Now, he was in probably his first American film was The Dirty Dozen. I know we talked about that before, but he played Vernon Pink. he played the half-wit Vernon Pinkley.
Vernon Pinkley.
So he was the one who played the general. He was a private, but Lee Marvin said, hey, I need one of you guys to be a general for an inspection. So he chose Donald Sutherland's character, Pinkley.
Pinkley. Mm-hmm.
And so Sutherland says, or his character, well, Major, he says to Lee Marvin, well, Major, what do I have to do? Well, all you have to do is walk slowly, look dumb, and act stupid. Oh, okay. So he does. And so he talks to the Colonel Robert Ryan, who's in charge of the troops, and he said, "Hey, these are fine-looking troops, but can they fight?" And Ryan says, "Well, yes, sir." Well, I sure hope so. Then he goes up to one of the troopers and says, "Hey, son, where are you from?" And he says, "Oh, I'm from some town in Missouri." He said, "Never heard of it." So, well, needless to say, Lee Marvin wasn't too happy with Donald Sutherland's character. But then a couple years later, he played the hippie tank commander in Kelly's Heroes. You do remember that?
I don't remember that. No, I don't.
Where his name was Oddball. And well, it's interestingly enough, both films took place. Well, The Dirty Dozen came out in 1967, Kelly's Heroes 3 years later, 1970. And they both take place in France in 1944, the summer of 1944. Mm-hmm. The Dirty Dozen just prior to D-Day, and Kelly's Heroes just after D-Day, maybe about late July, early August, because it's after D-Day. We get that in the backstory, and it's before Paris is liberated. So that would have been like round about August the 20th. Sorry for boring you with all these extraneous details. But anyhow, in the movie Kelly's Heroes, this Private Kelly, played by Clint Eastwood, finds out from talking to a German officer that the German have a bank that has millions of dollars, or the equivalent of millions of dollars, in gold in it, and it's behind German lines. So he comes up with this brilliant scheme. Hey, let's just go knock off this bank and we'll abscond with his gold. Well, I know that the plot may sound ludicrous, but actually it does have some basis in reality. This robbery didn't take place in France. It actually took place in Berlin a little bit later on, in April of 1945. Notice that.
It's interesting you mentioned that, George, because I had a lady friend years ago who I used to go see, and her parents were from Denmark. And they were World War II survivors. And she told me that the SS went into Copenhagen, into the central bank, and took out all the gold of Denmark. So I never heard that before except from her. But an intriguing story. So the Pope's SS got the gold, and I'm sure that the Pope is in full control of it now. He's taking that gold from that apostate, Protestant, wicked, sinful, infidel country of white Protestants or Lutherans or whatever. Take their gold. just as Wiley said they would do in 1878 with his book, History of Protestantism.
Okay, so, so this robbery took place, the actual robbery, I forgot the date, it was in late April of 1945, so the dates are a bit fuzzy. They ended up, a crew of like American soldiers got gold, and it was worth, whatever it was in marks, but the equivalent of millions of US dollars at the time, and they disappeared. Now, I'm thinking it's probably the OSS probably was responsible, but that's pure speculation. Speaking of World War II, I wish I could stay on one topic at a time. You remember okay, so just, I just want to give some insider information here to our audience. Usually, at least once a week, Brother Eric and I will talk off the air for a few minutes. I'll bounce ideas off of him, or ask him questions or things like that, because I'm always learning. And I recently came across a video about something like 50 senior U.S. officers who were killed in World War II. These are flag officers, i.e., E6 and above.
Was it that many, George?
It was like 53 or 54.
If you could send that video to me, I'd dearly appreciate that.
I thought I did. I'll send it to you again. Okay. And now somebody who we discussed before, and I know you talk about this in great detail in Vatican Assassins, is the death of George Smith Patton. However, he didn't make this list because he actually died after the war on December the 31st. So the war had been over in Europe for 6, 7 months, something like that. That is why he was not mentioned in the video. So I won't go through all the names owing to time constraints, but I will mention one. General Lieutenant, or as we say in America, Lieutenant, or everybody else says Lieutenant General Frank Andrews. He was one of the architects of what would become the U.S. Air Force. When he was in, it was called the Army Air Forces. They call it different things: the Army Air Corps, the Flying Corps.
Yeah.
And so
my dad was in that. He was a tail gunner in a B-17, and he had a beautiful, heavy wool-skinned flight jacket. It was heavy, and I managed to talk it out of him, only to lose it one day when I was riding my chopper. So anyway, but Army Air Force is the Army that was before it was the Air Force. My father was in that.
Okay, so he, along with others like Henry Hap Arnold, were strong advocates of the Air Force becoming its own branch, which would actually happen after the war. But Andrews was not around to see that because he died in a plane crash in Iceland in 1943, I believe, May the 3rd or thereabouts. His birthday, he was born in 1884, so around about the 3rd of February or so. So he was 59 years old at the time of his death. Now, according to the aforementioned Henry Hap Arnold, it was pretty much a fait accompli that Andrews was going to be named Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. But since he died, that who got that position. Well, so
the traitor Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Yes. Now, this is there again pure speculation. I haven't come across a memo or anything like that. So forgive me. Will you indulge me in engaging in speculation?
Sure, my brother. Speculation coming from you, George, is probably going to be the truth, but go ahead.
Well, that's a matter of debate. So, for whatever reason, Andrews was definitely part of the club. I don't know that he was a Freemason. Probably he was, but he had limits as to how much treason he was willing to engage in. So, for example, he said he was a vocal critic of the Allied bombing campaign in Europe. He said, "Hey, there's really no need to destroy all those beautiful places like Hamburg and later on Dresden. There has to be a better way because you're going to be killing almost exclusively unarmed civilians."
Yeah.
So
that's right. And that's pursuant to the Council of Trent, the killing of these heretics from off the face of the earth. And they used Bomber Harris in England Churchill and Bomber Harris, and they used FDR here in Europe with the American Air Force. So yeah.
Okay, so as I said, now he's the only one I'm talking about. I mean, I plan on going down the rest of the list, the 50 plus senior officers who were killed. Now, is it possible he just had a bad mechanic? I suppose. Is it possible the official narrative is correct? I suppose. However, if you look at all these generals and actually some admirals who died, plane crashes, suicides, being caught by friendly fire, being now somebody whom I mentioned before is Leslie McNear. Was actually a base, was it in Virginia, I believe, named after him, called Camp McNear. He was he was a vocal critic of the Allied invasion of Normandy. He said, Omaha Beach was a terrible spot to land. He said, "What are you trying to do, Ike? Get our boys killed?"
Do you know who oversaw that? You know who oversaw Ike when he made all those decisions?
Well, several people. Are you talking about? I would imagine Donovan.
He was part of it, but he was subject to this other guy.
Walsh.
Walsh was also probably involved, no doubt. But it was Archbishop Francis Spellman. You know, Spellman was touring Europe with Pius XII and some others, and his concubine, Pascalina. So Spellman, Pascalina, and Pius XII are good buddies, and Spellman was the chaplain for the military. So there's no doubt that Spellman had much to say to Eisenhower to tell him what to do.
Okay, and so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so but if you're talking about like one or two of these mishaps, like a plane crash here or there, that's one thing. But 50 in less than 4 years, that seems like far beyond the laws of probability.
Right. Well, they did the same thing with other officers too. They killed Reinhard Heydrich. British intelligence killed him because he wanted to win. So they killed him in Prague. They killed Yamamoto, shot him down in the Far East there with some P-38s because he was ready to surrender Japan. They couldn't surrender Japan. They had to decimate Japan and punish it for its suppression of the Jesuits for 200 years. And then they had to create the airborne nuclear war hoax. So Yamamoto had to go. And so they shot him down and killed him. Those are Jean Darlan, the great admiral in France. They killed him. And there are more. I name them in my book, but it's quite. The Sikorsky, the Polish general, Kim Philby in British intelligence killed, I think it's Vladimir Sikorsky, the great Polish general, and they killed him off Gibraltar. I mean, they were eliminating any generals on both sides that were seriously wanting to win or would have gotten in the way of the Jesuit plan, how the crusade was going to go.
Okay, and well, these sort of things happen. Now, but getting back to Donald Sutherland, who just died last week at the age of 88. So he had a very long career. So among other things, he was Order of Canada. So he almost certainly had to be a Freemason because countries that are part of the Commonwealth, that I used to be part of the British Empire's, part of the British Empire, as far as I know, there's only been one, such as Canada, Australia, they'll have orders like Order of Australia, Order of Canada, or perhaps they'll have like an Order of Ontario, which is provincial specific. So they're just basically, that is how the machine is tapping them. Well, thank you for your service as an actor, as a director, whatever. However, you
served us well. That's right. You
Yes.
served us well in keeping the people preoccupied and amused and no thinking. And yep, that's exactly what. False history to believe wrong history that will get you to do things that will further destroy North America, the Reformation.
Or Australia or Europe or wherever. Now, Donald Sutherland has several children, one of whom, or probably the most famous one of whom, is the fellow actor Kiefer Sutherland. And we've actually spoken about him before. And And yes, he has done other things besides the movie A Few Good Men. I know we've talked about that film a few times.
Where he attacked the King James Bible.
Well,
yeah. I was a King James Bible. So to further attack the King James Bibles, Kiefer Sutherland was a good little acting pawn to that end for the Jesuits. Yeah.
Well, there's I think you're referring to the scene where I guess Tom Cruise's character was saying, was talking about what he reads, and he said, "Well, I have two things on my door: the King James version of the Bible and the Marine Corps officer manual, or something along those lines." So that means all people read the King James version of the Bible are bigots, they're racist.
Yeah. Yes, that's the whole gist of it. And so, again, you show that the Jesuits are behind this in their elimination of the Reformation, because if you can get the people to depart from the Reformation English King James Bible in its present edition of 1769, you're going to finish off English-speaking Reformed countries that have liberty and written constitutions. And so they're busy. They did the same thing with Dragnet, the same deal. Go ahead.
Okay, so how does it bring us back to Rome? Well, Kiefer, like his dad, has been married several times. One of his wives was Camilla Cath. They were married from 1987 to 1990. And the name Cath may sound familiar because do you remember the old pop band from the 1970s called Chicago?
Yep.
Okay. And I actually like them because they actually have some decent tunes.
They had all their records. Yeah.
Okay. So they were formed in 1967 and they're originally called CTA, Chicago Transit Authority. But they probably should have called them the Catholic Transit Authority.
Yep.
Because, well, almost all the members had some sort of nexus with Rome, such as the aforementioned Terry Cath. Now, he's a guitarist and he occasionally did vocals. Now, the main vocalist was Peter Cetera. You might recognize him for their hits like If You Leave Me Now, 25 or 6 till 4, or Does Anybody Know What Time It Is, or Saturday in the... Actually, I don't think Cetera did that one, but Cetera did the lead vocals on most of the songs, and Cath did some of them. So Terry Cath wasn't with us for very long. He lived from the 31st of July, 1946, died on, the 31st of January, 1946, died on January the 23rd, 1978. So he was 31, almost 32 years old, and he allegedly committed suicide. Although he may have had some help. So he got his undergrad degree from not Loyola Chicago, close to DePaul University. And as a matter of fact, at least 4 of the members of the band Chicago went to DePaul. Now, the aforementioned Peter Cetera also, in addition to going to DePaul University, he was a seminarian because he was studying to become a priest. But that obviously didn't quite work out.
Right.
Their drummer, Danny Seraphin, yes, that's his name. He also went to DePaul University. As did
where's DePaul, George?
Chicago.
Chicago. So would you say then, since the Jesuits run Chicago through the Archbishop, wouldn't you say that DePaul has a strong connection with Loyola in Chicago?
They're basically one and the same. Also, another member, one of their keyboardists, Lee Loughnane, Loughnane, which is Irish. He also went to DePaul. So at least 4 members of the band Chicago went to DePaul University. And so you could say the band was basically a Vatican creation.
Sure. It's like the Beatles, just like the Rolling Stones, all the Vatican creation. Mm-hmm.
And so, so Terry Cath, who died under mysterious circumstances, his daughter Camilla was married to Kiefer Sutherland.
I see. They lived happily ever after for 13 years, right?
Well, 3 or thereabouts.
3 years.
Yes.
Oh, well.
So, I know I was going to bring this up, and this is a completely disparate point, but how many of these entertainment marriages are just done on paper? They're done for public consumption.
I don't know, George, but it's obvious they don't think much of marriage in Hollywood. The place to be, George, is to be rolling from one woman to the next. Mm-hmm. And that's success, and you're really famous then. But of course, they don't tell you that you've caught all these parasites and you're going to get cancer and all these other diseases because you have a huge, massive parasitic infection. But go ahead, George.
Okay, I mean, that reminds me. I know we've talked about Bob Hope several times. Now, he was married for 60 plus years to just one woman. But let's just say he wasn't the most faithful husband in the world.
That's right. That particular woman wrote the book on him. Bryce Taylor, when she wrote Thanks for the Memories, it had to do with all the sexual things that Bob Hope did to her, among other things.
Well, we've talked about him before, but he basically, he basically was an OSS/CIA asset.
Sure. It's like Hugh Hefner. Yeah.
Well, Bob Hope is actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Even though he had no military background, he was never, generally speaking, reserved for those who served in some branch.
Really? So Bob Hope is buried in Arlington National Cemetery?
Yes.
Well, he was busy encouraging the troops in Vietnam to continue their crusade for Francis Cardinal Spellman. So Spellman loved Bob Hope. And he incited the American soldiers to kill those communists and to further Spellman's crusade. Because, it was called Spelley's Crusade. Vietnam was Spelley's Crusade.
Well, he did it. So he was famous for doing a Christmas show going back to World War II, all the way up to like Desert Storm, like 1990 or thereabouts. So he did it World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and he'd go over to entertain the troops, just before December the 25th or whatever particular year. So you'd tell some jokes, and you'd have singers and dancers like Raquel Welch or
that Roman Catholic. Mm-hmm. Roman Catholic.
Or whoever was popular at that particular time in history. And I remember my dad said he actually saw him perform. It would have been 67, like Christmas 67. And it ended up making him feel worse because it made him homesick. And so it had basically the opposite effect. And, something I mentioned before, or I think I mentioned before, is when my dad was in Vietnam, he was stationed at two places, Phuket and Cam Ranh Bay. Now, Cam Ranh Bay is fairly well known because it was a big hub right outside of they used to call Hanoi. They now call it Ho Chi Minh City. And you basically, at Cam Ranh Bay, it was basically like an American city in Vietnam. You can get the latest technological toys. You can get washers, dryers, transistor radio, which were a big deal back then. Mm-hmm. And you could basically get the accoutrements of Western civilization. It was as if, this is long before you had Costco, but you basically, these PXs had all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so you thought you're essentially in the United States. But when you left there, or my dad said when he left there, he ended up feeling terrible because then he realized he wasn't in the United States.
Yep. And, it's quite an enterprise, quite a commercial enterprise, that Vietnam War. Go ahead.
Well, yes, because if you can get like color TVs were still a big deal back then, and you can actually get a color TV at a fraction of what you pay back in the United States. And but then you had to deal with if you bought the stuff, you'd have to deal with shipping. So you would make up for it.
We all those guys did that in Germany. We went to the Bitburg place where they sold all the stereo equipment, And we all got TIOC, reel-to-reel tape recorders and Pioneer and Sansui receivers. I mean, we got all the top of the line stuff for half price or less. Yep. So that was a big deal.
Well, I mentioned my dad, but my brother, Dan, okay, just to let you know how old he is. He was a regular Army back in the mid-1970s, and he was stationed at what was then West Germany, and I'm sure you could relate because that was where you were stationed. And
what was the name of the place?
I'm sorry?
What was the name of the base?
Oh, it was an Army base, so it wasn't Air Force. But he actually got a weekend pass to go into West Berlin. So there was like a little corridor, it was like 100 miles in.
You mean East Berlin? East Berlin, right, George?
Well, I'm sorry, you had to go. Well, actually, Berlin was divided.
You're right. There was a corridor in West Berlin. Okay, I'm sorry. You're right.
Okay, so this corridor went through
West Germany.
East Germany.
Through East Germany, yeah.
And my brother Dan said, "Oh yes, if you want to go the other side into East Berlin, which virtually nobody did, you had to bribe the guards." And I said, "Okay, what do you give them?" And the hot ticket item were Zippo lighters. They couldn't. They just were obsessed with it.
And they all smoked. They all smoked. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The Germans were the biggest chain smokers I've ever seen in my life. Of course, I understand their stress and being divided and conquered, but yeah, lots of smoking in Germany.
Okay, so anyhow, so it was like a big deal to go over to West Berlin because, as I said, it was divided. The Russians ran it, or the occupied forces ran West Berlin for like 40 plus years, from like 45 to 1990 or thereabouts. But if you went there, you got to see all this beautiful artwork and these exquisite dolls and toys and these handmade crafts, which were just like something you never see in the United States. Because, well, they just know how to build things.
That's how the Germans are. Whatever they build the best.
And that whole culture was basically destroyed, was largely destroyed over the last 100 years. So it's just like,
George, are you sitting at your desk?
Well, actually, I had to move because okay. I guess my neighbor is going to start firing up his 155 howitzers again.
Okay.
Well, that reminds me. I know I probably should try to stay on topic, but anyhow, as I said, my dad was stationed in two places in Vietnam: Phuket and Cam Ranh Bay. Now, Phuket was out in the middle of nowhere, but they had a South Korean Tiger unit outside. And during the Tet Offensive of 1968, the Viet Cong didn't attack Phuket. They attacked all the other bases, but they didn't want to. They didn't want to tangle with the South Korean Tigers because they were vicious.
Yes, they were.
And of course, their attitude, Geneva Convention, was that.
That's right.
And
they later went on to be the South Korean Rocks. And they were very fierce fighters.
Yes, they were. And, they had a fairly vicious reputation, and justifiably so. But anyhow, as I said, Geneva Convention, what's that? Well, speaking of 155 millimeter howitzers, my dad said the South Koreans had these cannons, not South Vietnamese, South Koreans. They had these cannons, 4 or 6 of them, and every night after sundown, they fire them all night long. And it was just like a steady stream of boom, boom, boom. And my dad had no idea what they're shooting at or why, but they did this every single night.
Psychological warfare.
That's right. Psychological warfare. Whoever you're gentleman is in the background there, he is absolutely right.
Oh, okay. That's that was my brother-in-law, Jim. I
Thank
need
you, Jim.
Yeah, you're welcome, sir. So, I'm sure you'll edit that out of the broadcast. But
No, of course not.
okay, so as I said, well, maybe it was psychological warfare, but it didn't really make much sense to my dad, and also it really made it extremely difficult to sleep.
Yeah, because you might not wake up when the rocks are coming. I had a friend that I lived in a little place called Tall Timbers. It's a trailer park when I went to Bible college many years ago. And the guy who ran it, his name was Chuck. And he was an Army Green Beret, I believe. And he fought in South Korea. And he said that the only ones that the North Koreans respected were the American Marines and the Green Beret. Those are the only ones they respected. All the others, they laughed at him. So he had some tremendous stories. And, well, that was the Turks. That's what the Turks respected. The Marines and the Green Beret. Other than that, they had no concern for anybody. But he was there in South Korea, and he talked about the South Korean rocks. And he said, when I was there back in the 50s.
I'm sorry, I just had to get a sip of water.
Okay.
Well, anyhow, so as I said, they fire these howitzers all night long. And, well, I guess it's psychological warfare, but it seemed incredibly inefficient. So maybe, and I made the facetious comment like the Tigers had never heard of the Geneva Convention because they're notorious for being brutal in their interrogation techniques.
Yeah.
Take prisoners alive is they could extract as much intelligence out of them as possible. And they were notorious for
one of the ways they did it is they'd take a North Korean, put him up against a brick wall, and take a deuce and a half. They take the Army deuce and a half, and they bring that bumper, the deuce and a half, right up to his head as he's sitting there on the ground and tell him, you need to tell us everything you know here. And then they would gradually inch that deuce and a half up to his head. And so they killed a lot of them that way. But that's one of the ways they extracted information by torture.
Well, and of course, they're notorious for flaying, after they got done with their prisoners, they would flay them alive and leave their bodies hanging up outside. So as I said, so
the Turks would do the same thing. The Turks would flay them alive, then they'd cut off their heads, and then they would suspend them over the gate entry to the Turkish camp. And they were called Slicky Boys. And the North Vietnamese, they didn't want anything to do, or the Chinese also, they didn't want anything to do with the Turks because they were utterly savage. I was told a story one time where the Turks, there was a big North Vietnamese army and some Chinese down there too, and they heard the Turks were coming in the valley, and they got out of there. Because the last time the Turks came in the valley at night, they took their Gurkha knives and they cut off every head of the Chinese there that were in that valley, and they only left one of them to live. And he went back and told the rest of the Chinese army. So the Turks had quite a reputation in Korea. And this guy that I know of, name was Chuck, he fought with the Turks. He said, they had us drink the most rot gut coffee we ever had, but we had to drink that first before we could fight with them. Yeah.
Well, so anyhow, unfortunately, my dad was stationed at Cameron. So he did his first 6 months at Phuket and the second 6 months at Cameron Bay. And Cameron Bay was heavily attacked with rockets and mortars and things like that. And, he said...
And where did they get their mortars, George?
Well, probably from the United States.
That's right. Because you see, all that had to be done was the mining of Haiphong Harbor, And that would have been the end of supplies going into North Vietnam. But they wouldn't do it. And when Nixon did it, that was the end of his political career. So no, they got all that technology from the district in Washington, from District of Columbia, and they built that enemy to kill American white men. Because remember, 98% of all combat deaths are of white men, further destroying the white men of the West.
And those who didn't die initially, how many of them had their lives destroyed with heroin and other addictions?
Well, 60,000 died in Nam, 120,000 committed suicide. Most of them white. Vast majority of them white. Destroying the white men of North America, regardless of their religion. Got to get rid of these whites. So that was one of the key purposes of the crusade in the Far East.
And something we've discussed before is, I know there are a number of films about Vietnam during the 1980s. There were before that, such as The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now. Well, they became popular during the 1980s with Platoon and Full Metal Jacket. And in almost all these films, you had in the background them playing rock and roll music, which, whatever was popular, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, Creedence Clearwater Revival. And, something we've discussed before, back in the States, when you had the protests, the countercultural movement, the hippies, they had their music. But the troops over in Vietnam, they also had their music. So the Vatican was covering both sides.
And they also brought James Brown over there, too. Yep.
Isn't I Feel Good?
Oh, yeah, all the stuff all the sex music that he sang. Mm-hmm. Yeah, James Brown there and Bob Hope. All their entertainers were totally run by the order. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I know that James Brown had at least one papal audience.
Is that right? One papal audience?
Yes. At least
that's
one.
When they were creating black supremacy with black music. They got to have all these white people singing black music and acting like they're black and being black and repudiating their white history and their high white culture and their high white music. So yeah, we'll have rock and roll and be white men singing like they're black. And same way with Elvis Presley. We've talked about that before. So it's the Africanization of the white men of this country and the white women and the killing off of the white men of this country during the entire Cold War. And which, by the way, Russia didn't suffer hardly anything during the Cold War.
Well, I mean, they did. I mean, they didn't deal with. Okay, during the Cold War, yes. During World War II and the Reign of Terror, specifically under Stalin, yes, they suffered tremendous.
Yes. Oh yes, with Jesuit Stalin killed 60 million Russian Orthodox people, something like that. Huge amount. He was the great inquisitor for the Jesuits in killing the Russian Orthodox people.
Okay, and so I'm looking at my notes here, and you're talking about something we've discussed before is how there has been a movement for a long time, going back to at least the 1950s, how America is this whole. We've had this thing shoved down our throat since at least the 1950s that America is an illegitimate country. That whatever we have in this country, and you could say there's in other nations like Canada. And by the way, they're
the only nations like that have to be white Protestant nations: England, Scotland, America, Canada, Australia. All those wicked white people, all they ever did was steal from the natives and persecute them. It's all nonsense history. Not a word of it's true.
Okay, so. Well, there's an old saying, I'm not sure who came up with it. It doesn't matter what's true, only what people think is true.
That's right. So as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. And if you bend these people to believe those lies, that's what they're going to act upon. I mean,
Well,
you don't want to know that Nathan Bedford Forrest had 46 black cavalrymen that fought with him. Of his 7,000 men, they were all cavalrymen. 42 of them surrendered after the war. I mean, we can't talk about that, can we? Why, Nathan Bedford Forrest wouldn't be that horrible racist that we're all taught that he is. So, don't teach the facts. Just teach the ideology, the propaganda of Rome, and the continual destruction of Western civilization, white Protestant Western civilization.
well, it's funny. We've discussed Edward Bernays before, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And Bernays is considered to be the father of modern advertising. And he wrote a number of famous works, the 1928 book Propaganda and the 1923 The Crystallization of Public Opinion. So these two works are almost 100 years old, although they're still completely applicable today.
Well, he was a Masonic Jew, wasn't he? He was B'nai B'rith.
Well, yes, and of course, as something I mentioned before, his daughter Anne was an adjunct professor at both Boston College and Holy Cross.
Yeah. Okay. So here we have some more of the Pope's Jews ruining Western culture, and I think Edward Bernays is the one who came out with bacon and eggs for breakfast. Just protein these guys to death. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so one of these things he said in the foreword to Propaganda, although he does pull his punches, he said he made a couple of stunning admissions. So, as I said, the book Propaganda came out in 1928. So you're talking roughly 96 years ago, almost 100 years ago. Well, and he said, prior to about a decade or so ago, so a decade prior to 1928, so you're talking the 19 teens, propaganda was used exclusively in a religious sense. As a matter of fact, it was coined in 1622 by the Catholic Church. It basically is a smear campaign. This is basically to describe the smear campaign the Catholic Church waged against non-Catholics, specifically the Protestants.
That's right. That's right. The minister of propaganda in Nazi Germany was a fanatical Roman Catholic named Joseph Goebbels, and parading that nonsensical work on the Jews and their lies as an original edition, which was total lies and fabrication. Go ahead.
Okay, so Bernays made a couple of admissions. One, so for about the first 300 years of his existence, the word propaganda was used exclusively in a religious sense, i.e. by the Catholic Church. As a matter of fact, the word propaganda is derived from propagation of the faith, i.e. the Catholic faith. So he readily admitted that. The second thing is, contrary to popular belief, or unbeknownst to most people, there is an invisible government that runs the world. Let me repeat that. He said there is an invisible government that runs the world, and that's what
Edward Bernays said. An invisible government that runs the world.
Yes, this invisible government you'll never read about its members in the paper, and they determine almost every facet of your life. What you eat, drink, read, watch, how you travel, where you live, where you work, and he also said, give it. In the not too distant future, with the inventions of new technologies or the expansion of current technology, their power will only increase.
Sure. Well, it sounds to me, George, like Edward Bernays was a conspiracy theorist, and therefore anybody that teaching what Edward Bernays taught, he's got to be discredited. So we can't say anything that Edward Bernays said with any kind of credibility, in spite of his book called Propaganda. So we just got to start eliminating those guys, George. Because the only people we're going to listen to are the coincidence theorists, not any of these people who know there's a huge, massive papal conspiracy waging war against us every day.
Okay, and so over the last 100 years, the situation has only got worse. They've become their technology has become more advanced. Their techniques have become more sophisticated. So it seems as if that almost every technology and every institution have been weaponized against the people.
Yes, weaponizing technology. But remember, Since we've been under the Emergency Banking Relief Act since March 9th, 1933, that brought the Trading with the Enemy Act inside the country, including its military jurisdiction in every federal district court and in every state court, all the people are enemy belligerents, and therefore by any means necessary, they're going to destroy these enemy belligerents, which would include high technology.
And or maybe not so, maybe just medium technology. And because if you think about what's gone on, I'll say in the last 4 or 5 years, almost everything has been turned against us. Your supermarket, your bank, your means of communication like your radio, your internet. Every day we're giving these stories about the case positivity rate in New York City, or how many people have died in India. And everything was basically trauma-based mind control. It was to put us in a perpetual state of fear. So, hey, hide under your bed. Don't leave your house. Don't go out. Don't shake hands. Don't hug. Don't talk to people. Don't smile. Don't laugh. Don't do anything. Just stop living.
Yeah, then that's what we want. We want you to stop living now, boy. You heretic. You liberal. How dare you believe in freedom of conscience? Read that Bible. Got to get rid of you people. You white people. Go ahead, George.
Okay, so I thought I'd change things up a little bit by mentioning something of a more local nature. Well, I did mention something of a local nature earlier when I was talking about this newspaper article I read. Well, I came across this organization. It's called the Marin County or the Marin Community Foundation. It was founded in 1987, and it's a philanthropic group. They make grants to how should I put this? To so-called minorities and disadvantaged people. And by the way, I take exception.
So it's pro-black and anti-white. Okay, that's always the canard they put out there. We're for the minorities and the disadvantaged. No, you're for the blacks and the Hispanics, and you're against the whites. Just go ahead and say it.
Well, even though all or most of the members of the board of directors are white, they do have one,
which validates what we're saying, George, that this white power structure is using the blacks and the Hispanics against the whites to destroy them, so the white power structure doesn't have any real enemies anymore, because we're the only ones that ever successfully resisted them, except the Japanese. But go ahead.
Okay, so why do I bring up this institution, the Marin Community Foundation? Well, for a couple reasons. I guess the chairman of the board of directors is a fellow by the name of Mark Buell, Buell, who got his undergrad degree from University of San Francisco. He's also on the Presidio Foundation.
What's the University of San Francisco, George, for our listeners?
Jesuit.
Jesuit, okay. Good old Nancy Pelosi, University of San Francisco, Jesuits. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll just mention a couple other members. So he is the chairman of the board of directors, Mark Buell, and as I said, he got his undergrad degree from University of San Francisco. I guess the deputy chairman is a fellow by the name of Mitch Cohen.
Mitch Cohen sounds like he's a papal court Jew. Is he B'nai B'rith or educated by the Jesuits or what?
Well, that I don't know, but dollars for donuts, the answer is yes. I mean, he's B'nai. I mean, the only thing I had to mention was his name. So he's like the number 2 man in the organization. Well, okay, he probably runs. Okay, he probably runs the board of directors.
Probably. Jesuits don't care who run the board of directors, just so long as they control them. So sure.
Okay, so another member is Bridget Moran, and she actually went to, she's from Quebec. She went to Saint Dominique High School in Quebec. Saint Dominique, that's Saint Dominic High School in Quebec.
Is that the Holy Office of the Inquisitor of Saint Dominique?
The one and the same.
Yeah, same guy, same mass murderer, running the Inquisition as the head of the Dominicans until the Jesuits got it. Yep, wonderful man.
Okay, Okay,
By
so
the way, are they going to change the name of that university, George? Are they going to say this university is named after a vicious, bloody mass murderer, Dominic of the Inquisition, and we're going to change it to, why don't we change it to the Virgin Mary or something like that? You think they're going to do that, George? I don't think
actually, they'll get back to you on that one.
so. Okay.
Okay, so as I said, I never heard of this foundation until fairly recently, so I decided to go look them up. So what they do is they make grants to individuals and businesses that promote their views on abortion, LGP, PDQ, PBJ, what are they calling it these days? Sodomites, and they okay. So one of the major tenets is their commitment to racial justice.
Oh, of course. Now, what's that mean? That means anti-white, pro-black policies, which is anything but racial justice. Remember,
Okay, so
black is white and white is black.
okay, so I'll just read directly from their website. Okay, making a meaningful difference to combating white supremacy and racial injustice.
White supremacy. Go ahead, George.
And in the U.S. means committing to supporting organizations that are rooted and deeply and trusted by the African American and people of color communities they serve. This includes organizations that are grassroots and community-based, as well as larger national organizations, many of which are led by people of color.
And they also love that term African American. There's no such thing as an African American. There are black Americans, there are white Americans. There's no such thing as a European American. It's all agitation to further the new right. But go ahead.
Okay, well, let's not deal with reality here. I'm just talking about her. I'm just talking about their.
I'm saying I'm just giving you handing off. I'm just trying to expose these little slogans and these little phrases that they have to further destroy past history and to make the white people trash of the earth. Go ahead.
Okay, so if you just indulge me for a little bit longer, MCF, Marine Community Foundation, also recommends considering organizations that meet the following criteria laid out by Marcus Wolson, President and CEO of Grant Makers and Effectiveness Organizations. I need to look more into him. Frame the issue, acknowledging how institutional barriers to progress persist today. Focus on root causes, prioritizing an elimination of social and political barriers to progress that systemically.
Yeah, institutional barriers. What are those? Huh? We've had black supremacy for the last 60 years. We've had pro-black, anti-white policies for the last 60 years. I remember when I was in the Air Force, what I had to put up with. I got out of the Air Force because of that. I remember a guy that I was in the missile shop with. He says, "Eric, I'm a graduate from college." He said I was going to be a pilot, but they had their black quota that they had to have for pilots, and I couldn't be one. I said, "That's typical." Yeah, that's institutional racism, and it needs to stop against white people.
Okay, so
only the best should be doing what's being done. And if a black man's the best in what he does, then he needs to do the job. But if a white man's the best, he needs to do it. They're promoting not on the basis of performance and ability. They're promoting on the basis of you white or you black or you're Hispanic or whatever, or you're an Indian or whatever. And they don't promote on the basis of ability. And that's what's further destroying the West, facilitating a successful Sino-Soviet Muslim invasion. Go ahead, George. I didn't mean to go crazy for a second, but that's just what's been done to us.
Okay, so I just talked about the racial component, and there are other things I could say. So, as you know, that America was founded by a bunch of evil white men who just wanted to oppress the blacks and then enslave them all, and kill the American Indians.
Typical black nation of Islam, Jesuitical black Freemasonry, hogwash history.
Okay, so anyhow, now this is not just an American phenomenon. This happened in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa.
All historically white Protestant nations. My.
Yes, and by the way, for our friends north of the border, happy Canada Day. I know that's coming up on Monday. I usually try to acknowledge our friends up there. So anyhow, so I was talking about their whole focus, their obsession with race. Now, let me see if I understand this. So people like Michael Martin Luther King talked about where he wanted America that was colorblind, where there's no racial distinctions. Oh, okay, you could argue as to whether
that's utterly crazy.
Okay.
There's no white people like that. There's no black people like that. God has put it in our bosom to prefer our own race. There's no such thing as colorblind. That's nonsense.
Okay, so
that's religion. That's a Jesuit religion taught by King at the Highlander Academy there in Tennessee.
Okay, so let's just say that is a desirable goal and that's attainable. Well, gee, how's that worked out?
Yeah.
But it seems as if that most blacks in this country are obsessed with race
and hate white people. That's why I call them the majority savage blacks. They hate white people, and the minority civil blacks are generally Christian people, don't want to be around them. But that's how the majority of them are. Yep.
Okay, so having said that, now we were just talking about their focus on race. Now, one of the other topics they're concerned with is so-called reproductive rights, which is a euphemism for being pro-abortion. So for a long time, they said, "Oh yes, I'm quote pro-choice," close quote, meaning I think it's a good idea to murder babies. But actually, they've adopted even more euphemistic language over the years. They say, "Oh no, I'm for reproductive freedom," or "I support a woman's right to choose." And it's just like, hey, what's wrong with freedom?
I support a woman's right to go out and commit fornication and adultery to her heart's delight. And then when she gets pregnant out of that, I support her right to cut that baby out and suck it out with a little vacuum cleaner. That's what I support. I'm a wicked, evil, immoral man advocating immoral remedies to immorality and sin. That's who I am. That's what they ought to be saying.
Okay, so to this end, on June the 24th, just over 2 years ago, 2022, the Supreme Court eliminated the constitutional right to abortion, almost 50 years old, rolling back a woman's basic human rights over their body.
The states are giving abortions. The Supreme Court just relegated it to the states. They didn't do away with abortion rights. More lies.
Oh, okay, this is according to their website.
Abortions in Pennsylvania every day.
Oh, okay, so just bear with me a moment, if you would, please.
I'll try to pay myself. Go ahead.
Well, why start now? Anyhow, so furthermore, as the Guttmacher Institution shares, more than half of all U.S. 50 states plan to further restrict or outright ban abortion, some within just days. Now, this is about 2 years ago. The court's decision will create a healthcare crisis in our country with devastating mental, physical, and financial effects on families across the nation. Data demonstrates that the lack of access to affordable healthcare, including reproductive rights, disproportionately affects Blacks, Indigenous people, people of color, and the LGBTQ people, and under-resourced communities, making reproductive rights, including abortion, fundamental and essential to racial and gender equity.
What do the LGBT boys, what are they concerned about any reproduction? They don't reproduce. What a joke.
Well, okay, so MCF stands in solidarity with those on the front lines.
Solidarity, that's another communist term. I remember that came out in the 60s with the guy in Poland. What's his name?
Lech Walesa
with solidarity. That's a commie term. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so MCF stands in solidarity with those on the front lines of the long fight to ensure all people have access to their reproductive needs. The list highlights organizations working nationally, regionally, nationally, and internationally with all reproductive rights network. Quote, reproductive rights, close quote, or the rights of individuals to decide whether to reproduce and to have access to full reproductive health care. Those may include an individual right to plan a family, terminating a pregnancy.
Isn't that wonderful how the devil's Jesuits take these words and they're weaving them around? And yeah, I can see the planning family. They're gonna kill your baby. That's the stinger, but they don't want to get to that and they want to say it just that way. Go ahead.
Okay, these may include an individual's right to plan a family, terminate a pregnancy, use contraceptives, learn about sex education in public schools, and gain access to reproductive health services. Reproductive rights fall within the broader focus of reproductive justice, which includes numerous factors that may serve as barriers to access to reproductive health and works to dismantle oppressive systems. Okay, where do I start? Well, they're conflating several different concepts. You're right. LGBT, PDQ, SML, PBJ, whatever you want to call them, they're not having too many abortions. And I know that's not original, but so I don't see, even if abortion were 100% gone in the US tomorrow, that would not affect that community. So whether, and so, okay.
I tend to think, brother, the judgment of God on this country for abortion is all the alien Hispanics that this Jesuit military government has brought in here illegally. You want to kill your babies, white people, black people? I'll replace them with these Hispanic Roman Catholics that hate you and resent you. Could very well be, but go ahead, George.
Okay, and you're right. That could very well be on the docket. Now, there are a number of ideas to unpack here. Remember 3 years ago when they were rolling out these vaccine requirements at businesses, and they're saying, "Oh no, if you want to work here, you have to get the poke." And some people were saying, "Well, hey, my body, my choice." Well, the pro-vaccine people were saying, "No, it doesn't work that way because you're conflating two different ideas."
One idea is to hurt you, and the other idea is to help you. So we can't do with that now.
Okay, so even though these shots are so safe and effective, we need to have pretty much everybody get them to make sure that they are completely safe and effective. Because even though I've taken the shot and taken a dozen boosters, you might kill me because you're being selfish.
Yeah, well, if you got all your shots and you got all your boosters, then you're safe. And I'm not, because I didn't get that, right? So why don't you just let me die because I didn't get your shots? But oh no, we're all commies now, and if I get it, you got to get it too, boy. Jesuit communism.
Well, so you could be a little facetious about this. However, well, they basically have rolled back that rhetoric. And did you know that all the people who refused to get the COVID shot back in 2021 have died?
Really? They all died. I guess that's me too. I guess that's you too, George. I guess we should be dead.
Yes. Also, something I may have mentioned before, that prior to 2020...
Why don't we say something equally ridiculous? All the people that did get the COVID shots and the boosters, they all lived. None of them died. That's just equally ridiculous.
Well, yes. And of course, I mentioned this fellow before, Dan Wilson of Debunk the Funk. And I've had to stomach through a few of his videos. And he said, well, okay, contrary to popular belief, it's not these shots that are giving people these problems like myocarditis, which is a fairly common thing. It happens all the time. Professional and collegiate athletes drop dead in their feet, their court every day.
Good allopathic, lying, wicked sinners covering up their murder, which they've done for years, ever since they started shoving these vaccines down our throats in the 40s.
Oh, okay, so just because you get, by the way, Wilson did a video on this, and he said, by the way, myocarditis is just simply a largening of your heart wall. It's no big deal. And yeah, if you get it, it's a bit of an inconvenience, but odds are you'll live. But
it's a massive infection and inflammation, and it needs to be dealt with properly. But the medical doctors won't deal with that. Go ahead. Oh, they're going to tell you you inherited it. It's in your genes. That's the big one they love. Everything they don't want to treat, well, it's in the genes. Cancer's in the genes. Heart attacks in your genes. You got to check out your family, and if any of them had one, then you got it too. And there's nothing we can do about it except give you some drugs.
Well, of course, there are a few other culprits. Genetics, there's like 3 or 4. Like there's genetics, which you just mentioned. Unknown. Gee, it's a mystery. It has absolutely nothing to do with all those Big Macs and Whoppers you've had over the years. or
For all
or
that
the other.
fornication and all that fornication, adultery you've been involved in. Yeah,
Okay.
don't talk about that now. Yeah, that's a forbidden topic. The inflammations, the massive inflammations as a result of that, which is encouraged by the CIA's pornographic industry. Yeah.
Okay. And of course, a couple of culprits, one of which we've already discussed before, is climate change,
Oh,
and of course, white supremacy.
oh yeah.
If we got rid of,
I'll never forget the day I saw that mulatto savage black who was a professor at University of North Carolina, had the big long dreadlocks, light skinned. He said, we got to get rid of all these white people off the face of the earth. And they didn't fire him for advocating genocide. That's okay. Go ahead.
so as I said, so people are getting myocarditis, pericarditis, thrombosis, and all these things that I can't even pronounce or spell. And I imagine most people can't pronounce or spell because of those four reasons: genetics, white supremacy, climate change, or we don't know. But it has absolutely nothing to do with these shots because, as you know, they're safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. And by the way, did I say they're safe and effective? As a matter of fact, people are coming back from the dead because of these shots.
Yes, yes. And the great master of it all is Fouchi, Jesuit Fouchi. Hail Anthony Fauci, savior of the world with remdesivir and all your shots. There you go.
Well, he was actually a couple weeks ago. I forgot to cover this. He was testifying before Congress, and it's just another horse and pony show. And they were saying, several congressmen, one of whom was Rich McCormick, who was a Catholic, was saying that, why do you impose all these things on us? And he said, what are you talking about? I didn't do anything. I can't tell people what to do. I'm not God. I'm not a king. I can't wave my magic wand and say, oh, you need to shut your business down. And you know what? He was actually telling the truth because he has absolutely no authority to do anything. He couldn't tell you to wear a mask or get a shot or.
No, he can't do that. But he didn't. Don't you think he had some influence that with these political pimps and whores when they impose these sinful programs? Don't you think he might have influenced that just a little bit? I mean, didn't Trump have him speak at the microphone, and didn't Biden have him speak? And then everybody say, "We're going to do what Jesuit Fauci does because he's a senior executive service and been with the health people for years and has the highest pay of anybody." Yes, Jesuit Fauci, we must follow him. And yes, of course he did it without his preaching and his crusades, and under the guise of science, falsely so-called, it would have not gone over very big.
Well, you just made reference to the fact that he just retired. Anthony Fauci, just retired a couple years ago, and his base salary was something like $480,000, almost $500,000. Now, that's not including all the money he's getting from the kickbacks from Pfizer, Moderna, and the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. However, I believe he was the highest paid federal employee, but he was not.
He was the highest paid member of the senior executive service of 7,000 people that you cannot fire. They can't be fired. And so this Jesuit is a kingpin in the mass murder that was carried out for the last 2 years with these coronavirus and the resultant shots that they imposed upon everybody. It all goes back to the Jesuit order. And until this idiotic, uninformed, ignorant American white people wake up to the fact that there is a military order out to kill them, it's going to continue.
Okay. However, there is a punchline here. He's the highest paid, or he was the highest paid federal employee. However, he is not the highest paid civil servant in the United States. That dubious distinction actually goes to Edward Shibota, who was the city manager for Palo Alto, California, which is where Stanford is. Now, back in 2021, so you're talking 3 years ago, he was making $573,000 as a civil servant, so almost $600,000.
Pardon me, George. I stand corrected. Thank you very much. And this guy, what's he? Is he a Jew or Italian or what?
Well, he's of Japanese descent.
It's Japanese, okay, but he's Japanese Roman Catholic, right?
Well, I don't know what his religious affiliation is. However, he's doing so well, he's able to send his son to Gonzaga University.
To Gonzaga, just there 2 months ago. Yeah, wonderful place.
Okay,
Big international campus, internationalist to the core. And you got the words of the Jesuit general carved on one of their big buildings there for their world government.
Now, so as I said, so Matt Shidaka.
Oh, by the way, a lot of Asians there too, I saw. So I'd imagine they're going to go back to Red China and man the offices for the Jesuits there in Red China. But go ahead.
Okay, so Shidaka, Ed Shidaka, he's the city manager for Palo Alto, California. So back in 2021, he was making almost $600,000 a year.
Really?
Palo Alto has a population of about 70,000 people. So you're talking less than 100,000 people. So it's not a big town. However, he was able to get this massive salary. So that is how he was able to afford to send his son Matt to Gonzaga. And there's an article that came out last year, one of our papers talking about how much money senior civil service make in the Bay Area, the San Francisco region, police chiefs, fire chiefs, city attorneys, people like that. And Sadako was on the top of the list. And I realized if you do a good job, you should be reasonably compensated. But man, they say that crime doesn't pay, but civil service does.
Yeah, now this is civil service, George, but was he senior executive service, which is federal?
Well, this is local. You're talking Santa Clara County, California.
I was talking about senior executive service, which is a federal group of employees that they cannot be fired. And of all of them, Fouchi was the highest paid, but there are probably other civil employees, or like you mentioned, this guy here who's got more than that. But senior executive service are the real culprits.
Well, and of course, most people. Okay, all right. Was it Bill Cooper? He basically said, most people know the statistic of their favorite third baseman on the ball team, how much, what his salary was last year, how many home runs he hit, and how many illegitimate children he has. But do you know who's on your city council? Do you know who your mayor is? Do you know who your city attorney is? No, don't care, because because most people, and I guess I'm guilty of this as well, don't know things that are really important. They don't know who's pulling the strings behind the shot. Oh, let's go watch the latest Kardashian episode. Let's see who's in rehab or who's
watch the latest House of Prostitution series. Mm-hmm.
Or who's getting divorced from whom.
Yeah.
Or whatever. But if you think about it, our politics is just as bad. It's basically, Donald, say what you will about Donald Trump, is basically his whole, the last 8-9 years has been basically nothing more than a tabloid magazine cover. With this whole Stormy Daniel thing and the hush money, and it's just basically a soap opera. And of course, you can say something about Hunter Biden. Was he, he allegedly, could lose his Second Amendment right because he smoked crack or something like that. Okay, I'm not a big Hunter Biden fan, but where in the Constitution does it say if you have a drug problem, you can't own a gun?
That's right. It's just an excuse to take the guns. I had a student that was a cannabis grower in California, and that was his profession. He was licensed to do that in California. And one of the things you got to do when you sign that license, you got to give up your guns. So that's another way that they get your guns through any sort of legitimate production of cannabis.
Well, and I know we've been going on for about an hour and a half, and we probably should wrap this up.
Yeah, we do.
Something I've said before is this going back to at least the 1960s, at least the United States, there has been, when it comes to veterans, those who've been in the service, the media has a schizophrenic view. They say, oh, well, thank you for your service on Armistice Day or Veterans Day, as we say here, or Remembrance Day. as they say in other countries, we call it Veterans Day. They say, well, thank you for your service. We'll give you a free meal. But now go away and die. Which is basically, they said, well, thank you for serving in the Pope's crusade and killing all these people in these far lands.
Yes.
But
that's what ought to be said. That's what ought to be said. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now, you're huge. Now, thank you for doing that. But when it comes to, say, taking care of you, well, they shouldn't take care of you. We definitely don't want you owning guns. We definitely don't want you using them. We don't want you organizing.
Yeah, because you might shoot some of us tyrants, and we can't have that now, can we? Remember when the guy who he rode his horse through Concord? Said the British are coming. Remember him?
I'm sorry. Who is this?
Remember the American patriot who rode through Concord and said the British are coming?
Oh, Paul Revere.
Paul Revere. You know what he really said?
They're coming to take your guns.
That's right. Same boys, same children of those evil, wicked sinners working for the Pope. You can't own a gun because you might be able to shoot them with it. We can't have that. Anyway, George, we got to go now. It's been on for an hour and 36 minutes. So you want to sum it up and give your contact info?
Okay. So, but as I said, this has been going on since at least the 1960s. There's been, the media will present a schizophrenic view of veterans. They say, well, thank you for serving your country, i.e. the Pope, but we don't want to help you and we don't want you to be armed. So,
sure. All these vets are been kicked twice.
Okay, so thank you for being a tremendous asset, but now you're a huge liability.
That's right.
And I'll probably pick this up hopefully next time, is there has been a concerted effort in several countries, but particularly in America since the 1960s, to militarize law enforcement, which is correlated to what I said, because oftentimes people who are in law enforcement will have a military background. They'll be in the Army National Guard or something along those lines. And they basically, you could say the military, like the Army, the Air Force, they're the foreign Praetorian Guard, whereas the police, they're basically the domestic Praetorian Guard.
The Department of Homeland Security, that's the domestic Praetorian Guard. And everybody else is federalized. That's right. Hey, man, George, hey, well, thanks for being with us today, and appreciate you coming here with all your wonderful information. And thank you for all the study you put into it to get this to bring it to the listeners and myself. Brother Eric John Phelps, 24/7 World Radio, thank you for tuning in today. I have a book, Vatican Assassins, Wounded in the House of My Friends. Please go to my website, vaticanassassins.org, and pick up a CD of that. Hopefully I'll be able to reproduce the book this year. Also go to 24/7 World Radio. You can purchase my broadcast for the last 11 years or so. And I have some other information there that might be of benefit, including my private citizenship classes, my tax class, and ready to work with another individual out of Minnesota that can do some very wonderful things for us. One of them will be property tax, to get out of that so we don't get moved off our homes and sent to the camps. So working on some very important things here. Appreciate your prayers for 2 minutes a day, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. You can send your gifts to rbpbchurch at comcast.net or RBT, Reformation Bible Trust, RBT, P.O. Box 306, Newmanstown, Pennsylvania, 17073. Or you can send a gift to Cash App. That's ERICJONPHELPS. Cash App at Eric John Phelps. Or you can send a donation to PayPal to rbpbdonate at comcast.net. So appreciate your gifts, donations, encouragement, prayers as we continue to expose the power of the Black Pope and the international Jesuit order as it reduces all nations to the temporal power of the Pope, which includes the destruction of historic white people, of white nations that read the Bible. So, again, this is June 27, 2024. May the Lord bless you as you read his word according to what God has given to us and indirectly inspired the Hebrew and Greek texts as translated for us in the AV 1611 Reformation English Bible, its present edition of 1716. Until then, Maranatha, Lord bless.
Oh, Brother Eric,
Yeah.
one last thing. Oh,
Yeah.
do you mind if I give my contact?
Oh, sure do. Please, George, go ahead.
Oh, well, it's to regard that I do that. So if people have any questions, comments, concerns, critiques, if there's a topic you'd like me to cover or go over again, please email me at georgewidger1969@gmail.com. That's GEORWIDGER 1969 1969@gmail.com. And God willing, we'll be on next week.
All right, Brother George, Lord bless. So good to have you. Lord bless those of you who are listening. Hopefully we'll be back next week. Till then, Maranatha.